Please hold on to your questions and send them in before we get dazzled by our next speaker, who is Matthew Baldwin. I'm delighted to say he's joining us live from Brussels, from the European Commission, Deputy Director General from DG Energy, and he's going to tell us about what he thinks the European Commission has achieved with its vast panoply of legislation and what he thinks the gaps are that need to be plugged. Take it away, Matthew.
Thanks, Nisha. And good morning to everyone in Trondheim. My goodness, I wish I was with you in person. And Jim, you have shamed me by flying 3,000 miles to be in Trondheim, and I couldn't even make it up from Brussels. So I'm very sorry not to be with you in person for what looks like a really wonderful conference. And congratulations for the excellent theme you've chosen. Building momentum, I think, is absolutely spot on. And a cliche alert. If you're riding a bicycle, you have to keep going forward, otherwise you fall off. And that is absolutely where we are, I think, now with the green transition in Europe and indeed globally. But we are going to keep rolling forward. That's my message to you today. I also think it's great that you've set up this session to have a discussion, if you like, between Norway and ourselves and the US. Perhaps even more than our US friends, Norway wins on proximity, our closest energy partner, our largest supplier of natural gas right now, second largest of oil at 15%. From the US, we now get 15%, 50% of our total liquefied natural gas. And both partners, of course, have come to this prominence as a result of our remarkable, rapid disconnection from Russian gas, which has gone from 45% of our total gas supplies to just 15% in 2 short years. This is the consequence of Russia's brutal war on Ukraine and the weaponization of energy, particularly gas. But the theme of today is, can we move from this necessary, successful action, and with our US and Norwegian friends, develop real partnerships in green transition to not just work together on the fossil fuels that have powered the last century, but to power the next century as we transition away from fossil fuels. Our partnerships are very close with both the US and Norway. We have regular energy dialogues at ministerial or commissioner level with Norway. We have this week, we have the EU-US Energy Council taking place in Washington, DC. So what we need to do in this conference and more globally is to talk about how we can jointly develop our competitiveness, jointly lead on climate questions. For the European Union, there is no choice. It's absolutely clear. We are committed to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. We know we have to do this to meet our binding commitments under the Paris Agreement, under our own European climate law. There's a lot of talk globally, isn't there, including at the COP, about who's leading. From a European perspective, we know we cannot do it alone, and we're more than happy to share. So it's great to be talking about this. From a European perspective, our key initiative is the European Green Deal. And I say with due modesty that this is a monumental initiative, unmatched, I think, in its scope and ambition. It's right at the core of our economic transformation. So it goes way beyond simply the notion of wanting to be greener. It's driving us towards a sustainable future by safeguarding our industries and our workers. Again, in the European climate law, we bound ourselves to that 55% emission reduction by 2030, sometimes called Fit for 55. And just in March, earlier this month, we announced our target of a 90% emissions reduction for 2040, if you like, a key waypoint on the way to 2050. Following our European elections in June, this is an extraordinary year for elections across the globe, which will set the path, I think, for the future. The next European Commission, which will come into force towards the end of the year, will have the responsibility to enshrine this 90%, this new commitment by 2040 into law, and to put forward the necessary proposals to implement it. But we've already done a lot of legislating in the European Union. We've laid the groundwork. And I want to pick up what Jim was just saying right at the end there, is that we are now moving, I think, in European Green Deal into an implementation phase. It won't mean anything if we don't implement this in the ground. We have to make sure this makes sense for our citizens, that they can see, they can taste the benefits that will flow from the green transition. This will mean actions globally. The COP is a great monitoring method for that. It'll mean actions at the European level, the national level, and let's not forget the local level, which again, Jim had on his last slide. We have in the European Union 100 cities which are committed to be climate neutral by 2030, including a number of Norwegian cities, I'm pleased to say. And that commitment to driving together to achieve targets which mean something locally, I think is super important. However, one thing is also becoming very clear, and I think this is brought out by exactly the discussions we've been having around the IRA. Whether we are successful in meeting these targets will depend on our access and utilization of clean technology in Europe and globally, in the US, in Norway, in India. The demand for wind turbines, for heat pumps, solar panels, electrolyzers, the new trends on carbon management systems, this is skyrocketing, and not least because of the energy crisis. We put forward our plan we called Repower EU in May 2022, which calls for a further acceleration of the clean transition, including new and ambitious targets for renewable energy and energy efficiency. We've seen the European clean tech market respond rapidly to the crisis. Just on the latest estimates, we think that 2023 will prove to have been another record year for new solar and wind additions within the EU. We saw almost 65 megawatts of additional solar and wind power installed last year. For the first time in 2023, we generated more electricity from wind than we did from gas. Now, the next point, the next priority, and I think this is an issue for Norway too, to make sure that we can meet the biggest share of this booming demand for clean technologies with European supply. We need to scale up our clean energy transition in Europe. We need industry to be producing these clean energy technologies. We'll need the raw materials to power industry, and we'll need to create a more favorable regulatory environment. We've already laid the groundwork for this through a series of legislative measures, the cornerstones of which are the Net Zero Industry Act and the Critical Raw Materials Act. Let me say a quick word on both. The Net Zero Industry Act is a new policy approach to scale up in the key sectors of manufacturing of net zero technologies, to make our clean tech industry more resilient, more competitive. We heard from Marianne about wind and Norway. Our wind industry already contributes an estimated 40 billion euros to the EU's GDP. It's already provided more than 300,000 high-quality jobs. We have a competitive and an integrated ecosystem with close to 250 factories building along the entire value chain in almost all the EU member states, and that should have sufficient capacity to cover most of the current demand. We account for, with our major European manufacturers, the supply of around 85% of our wind market's supply needs. But despite these successes, our wind industry is facing big challenges: uncertain demand, complex permitting processes. So we've come up with a package of proposals we call the European Wind Power Package, a collaborative effort between industry leaders and member states to streamline our permitting systems, to enhance our auction systems, to bolster skills development, which we heard from right at the start, the central nature of having enough top quality graduates with the skills. So no pressure, my friends at the NTNU. We need you, and we need better supply chains. This, of course, fits very well with Norway's very ambitious targets for 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2040. Of course, this vision extends far beyond wind power. From steel to electric vehicles, we have to have a strong and reliable source base here in Europe. And again, Norway will play an important part of that story with us, both, for example, in terms of hydrogen and in terms of industrial carbon management infrastructure, which will both be crucial for our hard-to-abate industries such as steel. And I must say, I'm delighted at the strong and enthusiastic conversations we've been having with Norway on both of these points. Which brings me back, I think, to the second point I made. We must ensure we have an affordable and stable access to critical raw materials to produce the clean energy technologies. Our clean tech industry will require, for example, 500,000 tons of copper for wind and solar, batteries, etc. 50,000 tons of manganese, 80,000 tons of lithium, 60,000 tons of cobalt for batteries every year in just the EU. These are huge challenges, hence the need for the Critical Raw Materials Act to secure a sustainable supply of critical raw materials, to strengthen our supply chains, to reinforce international engagement and to develop mutually beneficial, I stress that word, mutually beneficial partnerships with third countries. I think there's excellent work going on in the Mineral Security Partnership, in the International Energy with Critical Minerals Working Party. But this brings me back, and I know I'm running out of time, full circle to where we began this discussion about the essential nature to find a reasonable and realistic way to transit away from fossil fuels, which we've now agreed at the last COP meeting. It will require massive industrial efforts, massive investment to repower our collective global energy systems, which is why we launched the European Commission, the Global Pledge, to have commitments from as many countries as possible to triple the renewables deployment, to double annual energy efficiency improvements. I think 142 countries have now signed up to those pledges. And I think this is my final message. This will be essential if this transition is going to be pragmatic, results-oriented, but also just. We cannot leave behind those states that have become heavily reliant on fossil fuel production. 100% of Iraq's budget for its government comes from its oil and gas sector. We're going to have to find a way to manage that transition to help these countries move forward in a reasonable way. And I hope with the continued development and implementation, and I stress that word, of the European Green Deal, we've set out a useful blueprint for people to follow as to how this can work in practice on the scale of a continent. It's a strategy for an economy and a strategy for industries that are green, competitive, and don't cost the future. Just to come back to what we heard right at the start, I really want to underline there's no contradiction between what we're doing in Europe and globally, between resisting this Russian weaponization of gas and accelerating the green transition. There's no contradiction between the green transition and promoting sustainable economic growth. But we will need our skills, our talent, and our wit if we're going to build momentum and if we're going to succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew.